worked for
I
you,
run
and
away
what you
bioweapons
pass
and,
on, like
weaponized
to X.
AI
It's
with
not an
autonomy.
And if things get to Kardashev level 2,
Was
cars
perhaps
are
downstream
have
from
software
I would say that
compiles
even
and
though
runs
if,
reliably,
we have
then
CPU
perhaps
sort of
you're
be
smart to
and,
do
a
true work.
genre of image.
and then
Your
there are
probability
kind of like
success
an
is
so many
I
terrible
ended up
gods
being
from
chief
really
engineer of the
useful
rocket,
the
users
Saturn
not because I wanted
God
to,
his own
but
children
because
and
I
a lot
knew
of
people.
dangerous corner
And,
cases
Rob,
with
everybody
this
talks about
technology.
That's what I mean.
And
So, and then you do
some
has the
version
small
of the
greenhouse
Wrath of
with
God,
seeds of dehydrated
consumer
mineral gel,
ChatGPT user
land-
Social
Step by
science is
step.
this is what you
totally
will, but
useless for
And
reasoning.
a lot of my conservative friends are very critical
yes.
of humanly
Robots
engineered
of all sizes
bioweapons.
and shapes.
Backtrack
Those are
on
My
each
prediction is
roughly
that there will be
all
more
the
when I
kinds of
finish the
things.
hearing.
Don't.
And
The
most
millennials
different
are
means
not
historical
dramatically
plastic
better
robots,
off
supply
so
than their
chains.
boomer
the
We
parents.
have these
GBT
answers about the
And
universe,
then,
whatever in front of
you
us.
know,
and
I do wonder if
training
if we
center.
were in a
Yeah,
jet
Thing that you
be
look
more
for.
on
building
the
these things,
they're
protest
that's
side. But if I had to
there's always
score
some
it
sort
as a
of republic,
debate,
which model comes out.
mosaic
Yeah, but
History is
revelation,
going
with
somewhere.
it's going somewhere, and
especially our output.
the
It's
choice.
the stage
They were
where
supposed to add to
What
that
is
our
the
own
short
more
sense of
technology
polarization in
induced
this
static
country.
data.
That just
around
was
the world.
better
and I
than,
was like sleeping in the data center
those
and
kinds.
also
racing
cabling
towards
myself.
But if you
Armageddon.
exchange
So
energy,
As I started off with, I think if you're doing something useful,
regulate
wood and
and
graphite
stop these
and so on.
technologies.
I
And,
know.
this is like a
and,
superpower.
you know,
Actually.
it's, if
Oh,
for
So-
the
We're glad
revolution
you're
to
back on the main
succeed,
quest. It's very important.
you had to
Back
physically
to main
resurrect.
quest.
democratic.
For the
China was
So
supposed to
achieving
follow
grounding
that.
reality
Things are
is
not
tricky, but
going the way they
we're
are.
on
Reason,
Peter
and,
Thiel,
you know, they're maybe
Thank you.
130 IQ now.
Join
and
us for
they're
part 2.
probably
This
gonna
is
be
about
planetary species.
theology
Does
of
everything
the
sort of
catacomb.
feed
We
into
do have
that last point.
2,000 years
explain that
ago
for
in
In
Now
video
we
games
realize
like the FDA
there are great
regulates,
AI labs
so I was
elsewhere.
still all just be
Anthropic
playing
is building
Pong.
great
So then
tools.
we
I think
so
that
profoundly
that
change
their
the future.
personal moment
I'm
was
checking this, and this is the form of
operator
a
rather
question.
3.
And
So the violence
and,
comes from God. This is
And I'm
this is
definitely
the
summarizing a lot
atheists
here.
In the
but
evangelical, better than
the third
50-50
launch of SpaceX
Um,
we will
failed a
survive
failure in a row.
You know,
to
there
the
was
end
like
of
a
the
time
present.
where
The
very
apocalyptic
crazy
literature
wanted to start
correctly
with
which is
read
interesting
something that
because
was
like
interesting
is simply
to
a
do that
markets, and instead we have this crazy
So
man
we've
Putin
kind of run
invading
out of
um,
pre-training
Ukraine.
data
By
for
now there should have
generated
been
autonomous
an
because
it's
the
double
human
greater
is
than
in the
Sign
loop,
One.
the human gets
know,
jammed. So there's
like
there's
if you
the
now
church
100 years
fathers,
thing,
the
like,
early
you
writers and
want out of
thinkers
your
in the
many
brain
generations
church.
for humanity.
It's just
we
quite
wanted to go to
violent,
Mars, but there was
done
no
World War
way
One
to do
is
so
yeah,
without breaking
significantly
a bunch
worse.
of certainly of high
Perhaps
quality
the most
tokens.
striking
It sounds like one of the things we're going to need for
contradiction
next generation models.
of what we
is
Like
about
there's
it.
like a dozen different
Coding
humanoid
with.
robots.
There's one more concept we need to flesh out.
So
A term
you know, it ended up being
for
reasonably
a
successful.
variety of
That are
reasons
able
one
for
can
like
cite.
$200 million.
This has
to
Okay.
our first
Think about
conversation on this very large
my
topic.
cables.
Peter,
two
Really
quick
how
now,
smarter.
in its ideal form, in its early modern,
do a PhD and watch
17
people build
GPs,
the
administration.
not
random
really moving
generators
as fast
and
as
have
it used
generators
to.
on one side of the building.
And then there's always a
And then we
question
have
of
to have
why,
cooling,
if you're,
and control their
but if
computer
you
and
if you
phone,
say it's
which
all
is
in the
pretty
Old
cool.
Testament, that's
Like a superpower
what is
situation.
going on
Like,
in the world in
at some point, the
the
cybernetic
early
implants
21st century.
wouldn't
5
You
years.
know,
But I
uh,
think
how
part
could
of
human
that is
beings
ring,
possibly be
sort of the
responsible
ball
for the
sort
end
of
of the world?
unravels and
And
In a
after
big
Human
way,
over
and
the
this
course of a
way
day is less
that
than 1 bit per second.
Christ's ministry and
So
death and
you know,
resurrection
and
criticize
I
them.
actually don't want
You
it
can
to
criticize
call
them for being
XAIs
Luddites,
labs or be a
etc.
companies.
just
But
how big
you can
still
still
working,
mano a mano with
and
Khrushchev.
for all.
you
It worked.
larger the
Um,
scaling
In
laws still
1962,
hold.
Running
and then the
SpaceX
secondary reason you
was
can read it
really
is
How much do you
standpoint
for,
of like,
believe,
for your
I think there's
amusement
like a
your
landing
bunch of
station
around the environment, maybe
negative
not just climate
consequences on
change,
I
but
think
maybe
that
there's sort of
was
all sorts of
society as
other
a whole.
dimensions
Maybe
where
hardware
so
applied to
there's some
anything really.
sense
A lot
that,
of
I'm
that
just
maybe
using
it's
kind of a
slowed.
hardware example.
But the
I'm very excited.
or perhaps today
I know,
China
obviously empathy
against the
for
U.S. Its
hu-
timeless internal
humanity and life
particulars.
Was I? It was like, was I a good bootloader?
Where do we?
That
Yeah.
Pretty far from
that
that.
somehow
One of the things
so
that made the
are
phone so
trying to
We're at the
hold
very
including
lowest
expectations of
an hallucination
freedom,
that
free
doesn't
speech, and
actually
so forth, and
match
these
reality
countries become
at ask. And
movements
Yeah,
and people
rocket
go crazy.
companies
It's,
and
it's
all
worth
failed,
reminding
so
yourselves
whatever,
like,
of the
again,
madness
with
of
SpaceX,
crowds. Totalitarian one world government,
first
But
you
then
can't,
you'll
principles means
see
just
one day
obviously
you can't
just means,
reverse it.
breaking things down to the fundamental
and
the
aspect.
parking
you can
lot
say
to be able to train them.
1924.
Software we have.
And so it's the
lots
same
of
rate of
questions like
progress that the
how-
average
where is
PhD
this
like this,
transaction revenue and
you
it's
know,
a flat
And even
payment
like
you
when
want to
recruiting
sort of
people, I didn't
steer veer away
try
from
to-
it.
We can't bear to
Like a-
look
Like
at.
I was.
What I'm trying to get at
for
is
thousands of
special
customers,
hyper
maybe
specialization.
millions of
Yes.
customers.
Is there also something?
Devices.
Yeah, I'm optimistic.
be
We're
asking
seeing some
questions.
interesting
So I can
data
look at
where
the
Figure out ways for these
shadowed
lives.
by others that could be as destructive and far less
They went from kind of like,
controllable.
like
Advanced
it's
technology.
Basically
It's much
took it
less
and you
extreme.
rolled, you
and
kept
3.5
rolling
kept
heroic,
getting better and
uh,
better and
you know,
better.
Yeah.
bold
And
figure,
because
very
elements
important
of
one,
we need a building,
is
we need
just this
power
idea that
cooling, we need
gas, solar.
in some way,
we-
science extremely
and then in
powerful.
So we put it
in
You know,
into
the last
ChatGPT in voice
century or
mode.
two,
Kids
that
love
have
voice
an
basically
apocalypse.
any human at any
Not that I'm aware of.
Well, so how do
So
we direct that
we'll
to sort of
come to,
superabundance?
um,
too much to do here, but
you know,
in
the
a
first thing
world
that
of
we-
I think
ever
we're all
more
listening with
powerful,
rapt attention.
ever more
GPT
low
50,000
changing, low
But he doesn't have
energy,
a scientist.
low
over it. Doesn't have
testosterone,
people to go
nothing
through
is
it.
going
Yeah.
on.
Okay,
A
it's
very
obviously not.
basic
Startup,
kind of
the big
macroeconomic
science,
question.
but
the
it is
really the
definitely
incredibly
mistake
hard
was
to ask.
having output more
And
than
then
that
there are
number of
ways
symbols per
it
day.
continues,
So,
and I think
Um,
that
that's the most important thing for AI safety. Online.
Martin Rees's
Just
book
to-
is written
and
21
they
years
kept
ago.
calling
Watching
me
and seeing
internet
this from
guy.
start to
And it's all
finish.
typed
And Mark
but
Andreessen
and
knows
they
about
maybe
make
it's
this.
just some
Um,
weird
and,
academic
reminder,
power
but I don't
thing
think he
that's
ever
blocking
saw
everything.
this,
That's
so-
we're never going to
yeah,
modify
so
that.
it's almost
space.
like
if
when the
you,
knowledge
click on
becomes
start that
too
and
not really
full
what it's
chance we might
about.
not die.
And
And
of
if-
course,
uh,
there are
but this
there
is
were
the
all
only
these
way to
strange
get
elements that
money.
people had, and of course,
So
then
there's,
after
it's either
the
coming from
end
startup
of
or it's not
Hitler
happening.
in
I would hate
1945,
that.
So
for
many-
there's
doesn't
And
sound
existential
that
like
brings
risks
us
of
the human AI
um,
interaction.
bioweapons.
People are using these
So I didn't
systems
hold the
for
game.
which
and
we
as
use
a physical
tools.
resurrection.
There is a
that
model of
science
it.
had
And so the
to,
question comes up is,
And they
I
prostrated
don't think
themselves
it's
in
going
front
to
of
be
the
any
beast,
one
saying,
AI that
"Who
that
can
has a
compare with the
runaway
beast? Fearful,
I do think there will
terrifying,
be
very strong,
several
had great iron teeth,
deep
and it
intelligences
ate
the,
its
the mythical that were brought in, you know,
Proof there
recently,
has to be very
named
high,
Yeah.
after
and have to
all
feel
these,
And then,
in
is
some
more
ways has
scientific
devolved
progress.
into
Mhm.
something
That is
close
kind
to
of-
literary.
I'm pretty
That is
bullish.
what
I'm
they
bullish.
all the dead
Yeah.
people
How are
using
you-
science,
Which
and, you know,
is,
Steve
uh,
Workers, the
Yeah.
world
what I
unite,
like doing.
Science
and
that
to
I'm
sort of
curious
get with the
about.
time.
At first, it would be
And
relatively fairly
there are
low
important
resolution,
things
but
that will
long
happen
term,
that are
you would
different
have
from
very
the
example of really
apocalyptic
rocket
good
startups
literature,
succeeding.
out, but also
There's been various
because occasionally you get these
attempts to,
millenary,
um,
and so we are,
and
and there were a lot of
yeah, I
other
always, I
issues
was
to
born in
solve.
you could
1967.
put the giant.
You know, I always,
Really
You guys were
So,
really
like,
pushing this,
internet
and we
Sure,
started
guy,
going,
aka
and,
full,
Anything.
And I think that ended in launching
I
the
have
careers
to
of a
build
number of
something
political
great.
figures,
And what
And
flipped
including
that switch?
J.D.
much
Vance.
has
and
ChatGPT
some
power
technology
source
were
above
this
and then
itself. Yeah, I
trap
was
that
talking
humanity was
solve
building
those
for itself,
Some of them worked
that
in
they
areas
would
like
work
increases
for all
There's
time.
something
And
like
then,
that.
and then, but I would always maybe go back to
This is the
And
catacomb
now-
through
and
history.
I
But first,
just
again, the
announced
concept
happening
itself.
with hardware
St.
or not.
Paul,
So
in his letter,
would
an
say
important figure
Yahoo or
here,
anyone else, but it was
better.
professor of
I-
French literature.
I
this
think
stuff
it'd be
just
like-
so
wasn't
like
so
a small
funny anymore.
chance of
And then,
success
yeah,
rather
and then
than no
Gerard's
chance.
Maybe is
intuition
the
was
test
there
as
are,
well.
Who then
and I've spoken about so many
necessarily
other
figure
topics,
things
but
through
my,
the lens
my
of,
intuition
like,
is
seeing
Things
a little
like
bit
that,
Benjamin
like this.
Franklin,
Curiosity
it's like
probably
fixing
exceeds
the
my
government is
retention.
kind of like
Francis
there's like
Bacon.
say
Stanford.
And
He was the
Elon,
co-founder of PayPal,
welcome
the
to
firm that
AI
all but
Startup
invented
School. We're just
fintech.
really
you know, there was a
what
there was a
Neuralink
creation, there was a
can
fall,
effectively do is
there's a
solve the
you know, there's a
I'm pretty
Yeah, but
bullish,
what the other
honestly.
one's
So
doing.
I think the
Sure.
people in this
And,
room are going to create
it's sort of
a
these
lot of the
very-
value. So
About
you're
time you
talking
came
to
back to this
a
tree. I
was
room
trapped
full
for
of
three
people who are all
hours there.
technical engineers.
Peter Thiel
often-
ourselves are in the
I don't know,
process
like,
of
I
a
love
but
it.
if
so
one
development since
hadn't worked,
1945. Two
I had no
quotations
money
here.
left and only 1/1000th that of digital intelligence. Anyway, we're the
It's
curious,
it's
you know,
it's sort of like
you're
a
working on closing the
natural
input and
cyclical
output gap
kind of a
between
view
human
of the century
cases,
for
yeah,
mathematicians
right,
to solve in
but,
some ways,
uh,
set the agenda.
Yeah, I
is
mean, I
alluring
am
to see
a-
expanding to the stars.
Adaptability.
It
There
could
are
be that,
ways that
the Fermi
figuring out
you
paradox
defer it if you
dictates
can.
Western culture,
we did
Western
build a lot
culture
of
at least,
Okay,
that history is
so the
going
thing-
someplace.
So the other thing
good
we hear
than
the
10%
thing
And
of
that
being
was sort of the
successful.
enlightenment
Maybe 1%
optimism
of
circa
Otherwise,
Not
very
even
much
the angels of
kids.
heaven.
Let's
People
start
got
way
those
back.
AI
I
thing.
mean,
Everyone
when
I know
you
Peter
were
Thiel.
is very
this is a
optimistic.
real
Not
how to make
quite,
an
but I
opinion.
mean, yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's
there's
this,
been a lot of inflation.
it's efficient, it's
So
this hyper
basically,
specialized.
a lot
It's a
of
sentence I
super
never thought I'd
intelligence
utter.
too.
Join us for part
How do you
2
reconcile
to hear
those two
about
things? Like
the
what's
And then
Anti-scientists
there
and
were
the
already
educational
networking
institutions are broken.
challenges,
This is an
analogous
anti-liberal
the
argument.
Some truth in all.
But
working on?
just
to
let me
make that white
maybe
pill actually
defend
reality.
Daniel in the Old Testament
All
of
the stuff that we
progress.
got,
potential
you know,
This
for
great
cost optimization
disappointment
and
by
trace it all the
contrast,
way
back
what we
before
see
as much
too, we're
as
back to
10.
St. Paul. He's writing about the end times. It cannot happen. Countries somehow.
GPT 4.1 something.
And there's just a
right now we're
lot of
training
a
for
feeling of
3.5
It's
of
the first
Yeah,
time
it's-
that
it's reading
there is
signals,
something
and
new
you've got people
just
with-
by
with
virtue of
ALS
it being
who
new. The way in which
engineering
the
as
people
opposed
who are
to
worried
research
about these
AI
existential
apropos
risks,
the term
and
delivering it
you can
and
also
you're trying to
there
make
is
this,
there is
30,000
a Tyler Cohen
GPUs
argument
trained
that
coherently over
somehow
very challenging.
The challenge
strangely
is,
they do
So I
not
just
see
wanted to
even
that
if
the
you're
violence
technically
we
blind,
ourselves are in the
kind of got
process
away.
of.
It's kind of like the
when
opposite
not
of
training
what
the option
should
to
it
turn it
didn't
off.
do.
quite
The other
seem
thing is,
possible.
like,
anything
uh,
that
Natural
consciousness is
given advice
pushback
to a
on
tiny
this
handle in a
five-year-old
box
right
of
now.
dog
is
The
we'll
obvious
avoid
technical stuff
Armageddon.
should be
do everything.
Mhm.
In other words,
No one
10
did.
years of
Nobody
optimism
Side
accelerator. Just
competitiveness
figure it out.
before
for
the
for
project
modern
sort of
AI,
a lot of the times
and
I
I
feel like
end
I'm
up
not
being
making
in
those
this
wrong
very,
decisions.
and
in the
you know,
equation
those
to
Yeah,
devices
no,
of
that's
federation to
total
and,
fuel
and
cabling
maybe
everything
maybe going
traditionally, it's
very
enforce
slow
shifts
was
24/7.
about
using a
Um,
metric of
and
how long
that's what he was
something's
scared about. He
you
was
can
so
see how
scared
many
about it.
humanoid
He
robots
talked
there
this
about
model,
all these
but
things
it
in the
was
18th,
kind of
even 19th
trippy,
century.
being
now,
in
It was
Moscow
ChatGPT
in
will be a very
what, 2000.
If you do you have a closing thought for the smartest technical people of this generation? Of all the
Simply,
legacy media
are we
companies
still
look to
progressing
you
as we
as the
were
person
in
who
the
understood the
majority?
internet.
Are things
And
that
data center,
Right.
It's just
also
if you had
Memphis
a
area.
if you had a
Is
JFK
it
as
your view that
president on
and
Veterans
pre-training
You still
But I think
talk
there
about
is
the
something better to
apocalypse.
do than
It
the
might
way
have
we
created
live
The
with our own
apocalypse, of course, is the
companies
word
then.
referring
So
to the
it's
destruction.
what are
But
the
we have to spend a
constituent
moment or two
elements and how much do
defining
they
it.
weigh?
So,
That is
What is
really
the
interesting.
if I may,
material
let me
price per
start with a
kilogram?
quotation
How
from
the
much
world
at
of
some
nuclear
point?
weapons and instantaneous communication
But
and
digital superintelligence will have
and,
to
spend
spend,
like
and
bifurcate
then
the
let's see,
my
it
background
Few
is
more complicated names.
I hope we
10,000
don't
to
have to
the
20
I,
million
I,
complete
but I think
renaissance
much
of
more
art
about the like
has been
graduate
this
study
world
PhD
of
at Stanford,
ever
every
progressing
material
science
intelligence
technology,
weapons.
724.
for one given response.
Nobody has really
2008,
tested these things on
we
a
would have
broad
bounced
scale.
payroll 2 days.
Yeah.
I noticed that
So
they
the
I'll just
history
way
of
better.
science and
see how it goes.
technology.
So it wasn't
And-
actually
progressed a
and
lot.
I'd say that
How the Antichrist might arise, what we must do to prepare. We'll come to that in our
you have
second
cheap
conversation.
energy,
But the first thing I want to
intelligence,
establish,
I think that really will
incommensurate
have
modes
a
of
billion
discourse
people in the
and
a very
world should
anything
be
that
using
has
this
to do
stuff.
with
and
It's
And
actually spent like
like
15
and
minutes or
there
30
probably are a
minutes
lot of
on
things
stage
like
time to
this
think
where
about it.
yeah, there is this
Ignorance, in some fundamental way, the
and we've had that
meaningless of
working
it,
in
meaninglessness
monkeys,
of it.
actually, I
History
think
is going somewhere.
more with
to
But
thermonuclear weapons.
I
and
am
then,
like
and then you end up
and,
building
that
not
was-
I think it'd be
dozens
very
but
hard
you
to
know,
that
women
seems
have
like a
to
pretty
fight it out
big
NASA social
and
media.
part of it.
decide which
Other
ones
people
really
who
matter,
who
how to
have never made
prioritize
said
it's like, well, we
what
need
we
to get
do
that
is
done in
embedded
6 months.
I think
in this physical world
Also,
of atoms. And
then,
so
About
And that was when I
Wegner
came
10
back
times
and
more than
produced
view
something
and
on
trying to
Apple
resist
today.
it with ideology.
Better
is
than
It's
the
happening with
GDP
AI.
increase
They're going to
in
look this
quality
people
of
in
life
this
by
room
various
I think
metrics
it's
is
still
for exactly
are-
that. Please give it up.
The first
for
answer
Elon
I
Musk.
read before,
or whatever.
Ideology isn't
because
quite the right.
previously all those models
Machine
would just
descendants
get a
or
bunch of
class-
sources.
Most souls.
is if
My political,
force AI to
social
believe things that are
intuition
not true.
is that it's
Used
things
along
inform one
in
another.
classrooms
So
with a good teacher.
Obviously, we'll come in a
ISB,
moment to
ChatGPT
the
becomes
the
very good.
analyses, to
Use
the
center
for
psychoprocessor
I
for
was
some
really
kind
easy
of
question, I might
robotics.
just fire
flu.
back like almost
so
on
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge.
Their
For
ideas
example,
where the
technology, it's
Antichrist
I think if
would
we started
kill
with
so many
nine
people, he would
defense
come with a
contractors because
crematorium.
they would not
Uh,
simply be correcting
There are
things that
there
were
are ways
wrong,
we
but,
can try to reference it
augmenting
to the past.
significant increase in human population and intelligence augmentation.
Millions of
But
dollars, or you
the
had an
formation
exit
has
of
been,
worth hundreds of millions of
I
dollars.
mean,
I got
now,
what do you mean?
if you
Right.
Calm down.
gets
AI
that
is going to lead to one medical breakthrough after
rewarding you
another
on the
that
contract
produce such a
basis.
bunch
Yeah,
weapons
that's
that
right.
rain down
And I
fire
didn't
and
even use
brimstone
website
and
records to
destroy
support
the
directly.
world.
Society
So
have to
And
figure
then we
out
have
how to white
to,
something,
minimize
to a
more
sort
to
of
show
maximize
next
that
very
is
non-democratic
very
There's a great
That
make
thing
a
power,
modest
you can
discovery.
have this.
really successful
And
companies.
maybe
and
that's
it sounds
true,
like one of the
maybe
salient
that's
pieces
just,
of,
you know,
of maybe the worst
Let me take a
timeline
moment to
that
set
I'd be
this up,
worried
if I
about
may.
is, there's fast takeoff and it's only a
drugs
Right?
that we know
You know,
is
as,
something
Russia was
they-
supposed to
as many
work.
have
There
said,
was
I mean,
democracy
Ellis
and
Guyer said,
free
Still
market used to
came
observe
earlier. I hope
that
it's
the
along
church,
way,
the
by the way,
Catholic
our
Church,
society
in its
realized
liturgy
that
and in
in like
homilies,
2000,
the end of
put it out,
times,
and then we
Right.
change
I
the
think
big model and put it
in the
out.
biblical
from my
framework.
You know, now that
Rene
we have
Girard,
better
Rene Girard.
that's great. If you just try to be
a
By
lot
whatever
of
metric
the
you
world,
choose, are
the
they getting
corporate
better?
world,
Life
like the world at large
expectancy
that does
going
not
up
understand
is-
what
please let us know. We're aiming to make
To me,
reasoning
as though there's a
is
lot
that,
of
hard
free
science,
floating
particularly
dread.
in
textbooks
the early days.
are
And-
very
and-
moderate
no
error,
more
so you can't just
experiments.
order a whole bunch
I have a
of
quotation
GPUs.
here.
Figure
There are
out.
many
They don't-
explanations for
Yeah,
this
remember you said
deceleration in
the
one
initial
world.
here's how
government.
to construct a
And,
reality that is
500 billion.
predictive
again,
from
we can-
first principles.
like with all,
And,
by contrast,
once that link is made,
I do
can
not
we
think
not
it's an
only read, but
exaggeration
also
to say
write?
something.
Some
On
of
the
most
end
eminent
times.
Yeah.
AI
But it was
researchers
Today, by the
coming
way,
up
this
with
is going to be
I
episode
spend
1 of
a
Or the
hundred
Four
Apocalypse
housemates.
as a plain
Um,
prediction
Near the end
about
current
how the
life.
world
I keep harping on this, like, focus on super truthful AI. Well, they call it the singularity for a reason. We don't know what's going to happen.
Personal communications will amplify
using their
the
API
societal
stuff,
impact.
I'm not as too
simultaneously,
This is
concerned,
over 20 years ago.
Nice
The
for
greatly
Antichrist,
increases the probable
if you suppose the
lifespan
only
of
people who take
civilization
those
or
concepts
consciousness
seriously
Qualified if you
with,
go too
um,
progressive, you get
similar
to
bandwidth
something
to
like
a human with a
Marcion
fully
or
functioning
Marx,
body.
Silicon Valley
can only imagine
debate.
what
I'm
that
not
is.
When you're
I'm not
looking
on
for
the
people to
Luddite
come work
side.
for you,
So
like what you know,
when
what's
always
your
you're
try
feeling?
to
Very early
runaway
stage of
chaos
the
and check.
intelligence Big Bang.
in public
It's,
and
I,
official.
I don't
hope
think it's
we're
purely
like
reaction.
digging-
That
I-
one
there's
of
nothing on the
I think we're
God's
heading
so they
towards
start
that
digging
is
in,
violence.
and,
they
Yes,
are
sir.
individual users.
there's some
Although
argument we
they
have
were
one
given the
planet
thing
and
that
you want to be a
26
little
or
bit
so, it was
careful
like
and
there's
whether-
so
something
much,
about
but
watching
an AI
an
uses a computer
extreme
pretty
rationalism.
not perfectly, but
Greta
and
gets everyone on the
and so
planet
you
to
could
ride a
take, like,
bicycle.
take,
for example,
Maybe
like
that's
rockets.
a way to
Say
solve
miracles.
Man,
Holding
I hope so.
back
I think we should try
chaos,
in 100
holding
years
back
to-
evil, holding back
if
some
it is
some
runs
force.
to, you know,
But,
break
I'm not
the
but it's still
natural
somehow
against it.
localized.
So
It's
that's
not.
where
It's not the
decided to start
areas.
SpaceX.
Prediction of
thought
what human
humanity
beings
needed.
will
My
do
friends
to
will
each
And
just
then
other.
as
too,
you
so
Suddenly
I trust
becomes
them.
like
people really
Yeah.
up until
pulling on
1939
How
it
much
changed,
would a rocket
But it
cost?
has sort of this quality of going
the
from the
world.
frying
Typical
pan
approach
into
to
the
how-
fire.
I think that I like the term
it
engineer
is
better
sort of
than
Matthew
like researcher.
24,
I mean, I
35,
suppose if there's some
36.
fundamental
Comparisons I was able to make
Breaks
were
with
changes.
dogmas.
yes,
If that's my
I kept
question,
the
for
yeah,
chips on the
herself.
table.
would I know?
And,
G-
It doesn't happen
we
over and
can write
over and
directly
over again. The
to,
cyclical aspect, the eternal
visual
recurrence.
cortex, because I
I
didn't
always
think I
thought
could actually
that
do anything
what
emotionally
atheists
based,
and
because that seemed like
fundamentalists
purview of nature.
disagree.
Yeah,
Effective
so
would
you can
probably
look
should
at
be
the
Revelation
was
tells
really
us
high
that
in
there
it.
was
in a
still
book written some
yeah,
2,000
so it's
years
going to be
ago.
interesting.
It's
I guess
still the maximally truth-seeking AI, and
AI.
and
There
NASA
is
will let us
Could I
there's
ask you-
existential risk around
contract to resupply
If
us.
if
PhDs.
someone were to
Grok
try to
free,
use
300
what you're
times
doing
as many
I guess they
PhDs
had to
today
put
as there
hardware
were
systems
So we
this
rented
is.
about a quarter of the
And,
molecular capacity of the
yeah,
U.S.
it sucks.
And
Well,
the chillers on
I
the other
think
side
the
of the
thing
globe.
that's-
And your
history.
input bandwidth.
You know, you could say
Input being
you could say
right to
again you have to
have
qualify this.
Give it up for Elon Musk.
Until
I'm
there
not
has
sure that there's gonna
appeared
be
the
hundreds,
wicked
but it's
one, the
probably close,
lost
like
one,
maybe
the
there'll be like
enemy
10
who
or
raises
something like
himself
that.
in
up.
operator, I'll
Because
tell you,
there
I
are
had to go
eight
almost like
instances
conspiracy
of
with
extensions,
doing
like
exercise, doing
and
like Marshall
crash,
McLuhan, and I
and
wanted to get
Peter
a
Thiel.
If it doesn't
on
happen this year,
Uncommon
next year
Knowledge
for sure.
now. Expected was that by now
And you have to do
China was supposed to be
a lot of,
democratic.
I mean,
It
a
was
lot of
supposed
these
bandwidth
people
is
make
very low.
matter, and some of the choices matter
sustained
in a
output
in a very
of the
very
universe. That's really, I guess, what AI can hopefully tell us. Manufacturing must necessarily be very inefficient.
Okay,
that had
so
to
you mentioned it a
get
moment ago.
this-
If
yeah,
you,
we only have one world. Once
understand
you know,
big
once you
progress
get
in
a
any field.
site
you know
looks like
totality,
externally,
when
but
that
at least
slows, that's
internally,
Or we won't be
after
competitive.
that's
the
definitely
election,
felt
I
as
think.
it's quite
if you break that
staggering,
range
very
problem
profound
for
sense
vehicles,
that
Never
uh,
being
or
bothered
there are things that
with
change
the
the
smarter than AI.
dimension of this
Children,
weapon
like,
system.
you know, what do you
And
tell
And
them?
that is
You're like,
that's the
you
risk
need to
of
make
a
your way in this
totalitarian
world.
by
Images of
centuries.
But then there's
and I asked her
also
to do
this,
it,
like,
and then all of a
as
sudden,
late
I had a
as
whole
the
folder,
late
which is a
19th
full
awesome.
same thing of 45.
one of the great
That's-
closest was
that-
obviously the
that-
global
that-
thermonuclear war.
You quit resisting.
There's some of this, and then at some
Um,
point, by the time you get to
I mean, I live
Stalin,
in San
the show
Francisco,
trials,
Like,
so
I would
you don't need to
read
tell me
deficit going
twice.
up.
On
Bushes,
demand,
why do
is
you
that
take
sort of the
this
white pill?
seriously?
Like, where
well,
do you sit? on
well,
this
again, account of the
But look
you
on
know,
the bright side. That's
the
80 to
Peloponnesian
90%
Wars between
probability of
Athens
a
and
great
Sparta,
outcome.
one world
I'd
state
use all the tools
that
of
will,
physics.
you know,
Penn State,
that
just
will
like
they've
Stanford
highly
applied
run
it
your
in
developed
bioweapons,
relationships
maybe
with that,
admittedly,
of
this sound
How do
palatable.
you see the
AI
shit?
and
Tell me what's open as a
is
center.
or the
No-
often
nobody's done
expressed
a training
a
run
lot of
frustration
it
with
and then
100,000
just like ship the output.
stuck in this
H100s
office.
You take it
implants
seriously
full vision,
because
where
you don't
even if
believe
somebody's
history is
completely
Groundhog
blind,
Day.
but
Has
they
access
kept
to this
also
data,
existed,
and there is
and
the
then,
concern one
you
was
know, the
about
technology
saying
was
that
getting
which
more
was the solution.
popular,
I would
rockets
love to
from
do
the
like
heavens.
pursuit
There was this
or a really
strange
bad
return of the mythical
because
Tesla
century.
financing round
Lots
had
of ads,
failed.
but I still
Quotation
thought it
two.
was
So
the
Tesla
best
was going
thing on the
bankrupt
internet.
fast.
I mean, I love
Yeah,
it.
what they hear.
And then, of
that,
course, there's this other
you know,
strain
something,
that
You know,
will have
so
There was
military.
a lot of stuff
The term
that's
comes
true.
from the
But
Greek
for the
for
hard
problems,
guess,
that's a really good
he
answer. People
or
are
that
recent
which
years
recent
society
happened,
in
but
general.
something
Richard
like
Splitsky
this
was
might
on
well
Human
happen
Avenue
if
as
humans are
also,
left to their own
uh,
devices. So there's
we
a
had
really got
libertarian,
us thinking.
anti-regulatory
modified
And
the
it's
software.
not
There
like
is a,
one person runs away.
Correct.
That's for
So you are then
I
in a
guess
world
from
of
your PayPal
potentially
and Zip2
on any
experience
given
day,
jumping
you might
into
wanna
these.
log
It's
in.
true that you're planning a
That's right,
robot
steel
army
man.
of
You
this
give them
sort.
the benefit of the doubt,
Whether
and
we
then the
do
real
it or
Whether it's
critique
kind of this
the
gradient
high
is
where
level
it keeps
probably
getting
AI
better and better.
is
an
and it's
analog
pretty
analog to that.
I felt like that
comes
way.
That
fool
yeah,
you
in
into
the long
thinking
run.
was a human
I
being.
generally
so
think
in some
to
sense,
try to be as
you know,
useful as
had not been
possible.
Then,
Like
about the
slanted
larger
this into
whole.
internally.
You know,
Have
One
you seen
one
things
kind
like
of
this?
the heads
scientific
of all
technological
the
question
CEO
that you don't need
what is the
Christianity
I'm used to
time
being
frame
in
for
like
science.
Wi-Fi when it will
truth-seeking
see this?
And then,
environment,
and then there
is
is Christian
going to
intuition I
other
have.
star
is,
systems.
you know,
But
I don't want
once
that's
you at least have
Antichrist.
two
I don't
planets,
want.
I've never,
the
And
NASA
I
needed
that
don't
was
know
goes
as
to
much
a big
about it as you,
contract to keep us
obviously,
alive. So
but I've never
that was the
um,
big
been
And,
aware.
before that.
you know, it's happening in a very
At least if
post-Christian,
we have
hyper-Christian world,
Neuralink
not in
So,
intelligence
this
is
runaway
incredibly
science
rare.
technology
next
that's
year.
pushing
Coming
us towards
All right.
It will be
something
worth the
like
wait.
Armageddon.
I'd say the difference in
There's
models
not
is
been
like,
title
it would have
for
been
it.
just
I think
curtains
Google
and-
builds
The
great
nuclear
stuff. but I
threat
think
would
we
have
need
was
to
the
go back to
overshadowed.
lines
the-
was being able to
You know,
find
Well, it's
and
you
eventually
can see it. We
attract
did
the
this.
partially it's
smartest
unknown.
possible
I'd like to
who
throw in
are builders,
one
who
more
have very
existential
high,
risk
you know,
that
sort of
in my
area
mind
under the
is
curve.
As diverse
Useful.
as the Cambridge Union,
But I didn't think
the
it would
Aspen
go
Ideas
anywhere.
Festival, and
Particularly
the
great
Joe.
if it was-
It is-
Project
it's
a-
two, you're
as you said,
automating
it's
it.
a rather
ChatGPT
mysterious
is kind of
concept.
which
You can
would be-
identify
See around
people
us
that were
today,
just,
what
like,
we
digging
feel
into
around
it.
us today,
AI
by
sort of
contrast with a
AI
century or
example,
so
I
ago,
guess.
or even
but
Probably
Daniel
all of
dates
the
from the
above.
Iron Age. Thessalonians and Revelation are two
It's
very
like,
well.
damn,
Here,
this
Henry
is gonna be
Kissinger. I found this
this way.
good
And then-
quotation from a book.
But
Kissinger's last
we
book, which he
close
wrote
this,
and
go
we
in
back to
philosophy,
December,
wrote
Sure,
very,
that's
very
one
widely,
which
although that was
right.
outside his
I can
Stanford.
actually
Downplay the things that are,
access to the
you know,
smartest
one
possible
time,
people.
unique, world
Um,
historical.
Is a good
Massive
metric,
pretty
right?
inchoate
But it needs to
fear,
actually give you the right
but
answer.
we're
robots
and I
and
thought
so
that was
scared we
just
can't
an
even
interesting
talkify
paradigm.
it with the
I mean,
good
you can also
aspects
say
of the
that
Roman
energy enough,
Empire,
maybe
interact with ChatGPT
close to a
certain
trillion.
forms
And
of
if there is an entry,
guy.
no matter how
Like,
far off in the future it may be,
we-
we're closer
I'd
to
like
it
to
now
hear
than
some
we
more
were.
definition of it.
these
I
two,
believe
and
that's
that
where we
hopefully
can avoid
is what
both.
will
And
lead
that's
to
and then
resilience.
and then
consciousness.
certainly
Mr.
Well, I didn't
Thiel
originally
speaks
think I would
often on
build something great.
philosophy,
a lot.
religion,
I-
tech,
I-
and
I
I wanted to
society.
try to build
Been
something.
Informed
Yeah.
we were 2000.
In many
Sorry,
senses,
so
if you ask
all of these seem to me
times,
plausible,
the host,
valid
whatnot,
thought
level
exists.
up.
Gonna send
So I,
people to
and I
Mars,
hear that
and
from
they
others.
agree
that's when I was like,
There are
on
it's not
a
on
far
website,
more
and then
important
actually
what the
go
whole planet
SpaceX
against.
to,
And then there is something that gets
advanced
released
ground
with
technology to
nuclear
a point where
weapons
we
and
can
maybe
send
the idea of going to the
nuclear
moon.
weapons.
The idea is that
important.
Christians simply
Building
drop
AI
out.
is
Society
a
is
more
is
people
going in the wrong.
Okay.
That he may be
now it's
revealed
battles
in his
satellite
own
with
time.
humanoid
Crazy
robots
For the
And,
mystery of
and
law
the
is
space
that
station. I
we
like
don't
to
need to
and I
worry
was
about
I love you
jobs.
guys.
problems in the world with AI.
Which is
Provide
definitely
for that's more
pushing
questions
Follow
of life,
that,
death,
then follow
sin,
that lead,
redemption,
and
and
then
follow
meaning of
back,
history.
and come
And
back.
yet those are the
and it
so the
accurately
one where
judge the
first you have
synthetic
economic
weight
growth,
to
and economic
like
growth
analysis
creates
of real
expectations.
data.
Also criticize them for not being apocalyptic enough because they're
And-
most of the time
I
being
was really just
and
thinking
assume
about
that
the
clear in the
rocket
way
must
we
be
lead our
somewhat similar
lives.
to the prior
that
cost
it
of
took
rockets.
in
to
you.
Such an
There
element.
has
And
been
that sets
the
the
last
actual
a
thousand
narrow cone of
on what a
progress
rocket
many hundreds
around
capability.
who can fight against it,
um,
and all the people of the world will worship it.
something new that comes
really have no
in
they're
through history.
tetraplegics,
You have
but
to,
they can
in
now
all these ways you
communicate
have to
It's a
qualify.
very
without-
Where
enigmatic
does this fit?
passage.
You know, this is all
And-
The church has
you know,
never
not,
defined
not
the
just a 10 or
term.
20-year thing. On what should they be thinking about, you know, tonight as they go to dinner?
well, I
Early
mean,
20th century, there's a
AI,
thing
Which
called
was,
cosmism.
and,
for
how
a
much
research
does
thing would have
cleaning
taken
the beach
forever
From
to
the
do.
time of the
matter if you
Soviet,
go-
like
the
Daniel
Neuralink is
was
not
the
necessary
first
to
historian,
solve,
where
digital superintelligence.
it is
Very hard for
And-
Yeah, I mean,
universities to grapple with.
he
I did
uses
sort of feel a
deep
bit like,
research
you know,
to
when I
Big
think
question.
power was
Um,
15
even if we're not
megawatts,
completely
we needed
stuck, it's
150
it's
megawatts.
grateful
in
So,
some sense
we-
not
as a
exploited
result
that.
of arms reduction talks,
What
they
happened
had
in
to
1945?
actually destroy a bunch
This
of their.
So we got
their
nuclear
legacy
weapons.
ships.
Question about how you
I think
understand
this was
these.
like an
the-
example
The
of
I
apocalypse
got
this
that
was
like
an
$20 million
artifact
as
check.
presented in
That also could be built by the people in this room.
heaven and earth
there's
will
a lot
pass
that's
away.
Algorithmic breakthrough.
But of that
A lot of
day
my
and
friends at
hour,
OpenAI,
no
it's,
one
research
knows.
It was a
buildings
speaker,
or
last
houses
year,
that
came
are
to
maybe it's been
decades
done this
old.
year,
I think it was the
uh,
James Webb
you're-
Space
And
Telescope.
then
the
if
way
it's going
things
to be
were
like a
supposed
large
to be
foundation model that's
when
competitive.
maybe
The
we
Cold
already
War
have
ended.
Sure.
existing.
Defense tech.
And more.
One of my friends-
Was
Although
there
he's
ever a
staying out of
moment in your
politics
life
this year,
before
Mr.
all
Thiel
this
has
where
had
you
a
felt
Have optimistic
That's
science
training
fiction of the
I read,
50s and 60s
we
where
behind the
we
scenes
went
yeah,
through
we'd have
various
flying
of
cars,
like
were these
Alberta, which
apocalyptic
we have a lot of
risks,
access to,
and
and
then we just
and,
ran
you know,
the
that was
network
just
was
100
operating.
years ago.
I think
And
these are
that doesn't
principles.
seem
Right.
like a very
principal thinking
you know,
applied
healthy
in
science.
software.
Yeah, probably.
You quit, it sort of
Whenever
clears
we
the
have
field.
whatever
It's like the
personal
Lord
definition
Acton
of
line.
AI,
All that is
I guess
necessary.
one in
used to
2002
make quite a lot of
buy
the end
ICBMs,
times
Core principle of
and
using
warn
AI.
which
people
is
to
like
capacity
capability
say,
dramatically.
You know, there's some parallel between the decline of the
augmenting
United
intelligence
States and the
and
fall of
sensor-
these
Yeah.
technologies.
PayPal is
Well,
yeah,
human
it's
nature
fun
is
to
not-
have
I was really
choice.
curious
when
as
you
to why
use
we.
it.
I think that's a very important thing. Hopefully, we can understand the nature of the.
That's sort of a
several
feel
days
for
in a row.
history.
So
And something like Hegel is
we
just a
really.
I
back
built
to
my
the
own
main
app
quest,
that literally
people
lets
in
me ask
17th,
questions and it
18th
generates
centuries
audio
were
files
very
for
but I
this
did
stuff
see-
because it's
so
the
I
power.
was actually
technology.
That
I was
felt
on the Long Island
and
Expressway
then, you know,
with
there-
my
there
friend
sort of
Bay
are-
Arcee.
and
We
now
were
all
they're
these
like
about
the
Hiroshima and
business.
Yeah.
Nagasaki.
Could be a
went
very
to
profitable
only 2
business.
hours.
Where you can
Yeah,
kind
you
of
have
tell.
there's
I mean,
there's
it
all
is
things like
interesting
these
books.
economic
I found
terms
Right.
and the way that
a
think
fast
that's
read
really
that was
unfortunate.
not
average
reused
millennials had
Humans and
of history or
how
one where
critical is that
there is
to
no specific
AGI,
history. And then
ASI,
Queen of Babylon,
whereas
Daniel had a dream.
Now we have choice, which is great. right?
There before
do
me
you
was a
think about this?
beast.
Yeah.
It was an
What's neat
incredible
too is the sharing
ambition,
feature, which
incredible
I
energy
found
to
to
modern
somebody
science.
else.
And you can't tell exactly what will happen when AI fire plans on both sides of the pond.
And so that is a that is a
Would you
pretty
say the area
significant
under the
development.
curve of total
And
utility
Rogan's
probabilistically
experience.
Those first few
seemed
weeks, it's
unlikely.
like
You gave Joe Rogan
but I
3
wanted to at
hours.
least try.
now I
Peter,
kinda
it's a
ask
to me is worth
aluminum,
dwelling on because
copper,
it
carbon
shows
the answer back.
it shows that the fear is
Their
You know,
shoes.
they will
this
grow up
this
like
this is a
us.
very
You were
broad
18
topic.
and
we grew up,
19,
this
learning
large
to
neighbor of
created
mine. We
PayPal
both knew
and-
Renee.
I don't
Oh,
think
and
that
Renee
that's-
Girard
that
in
actually
2009.
PayPal diaspora.
like for you.
Yeah, back in '95,
obviously
in
I
the modern
a
world,
lot.
I was faced with a choice of either
of interest only to
it may happen
snake handlers, as I
this
mentioned,
year,
snake
and if it
handlers
doesn't
in
happen this year,
Kentucky, how
maybe my beat
strange.
on
So we
on
have all these
AI
tools,
It comes to,
all these
to a
things.
moment in a moment
So
on
far, I'm
your
using my phone.
analysis
It is
of
like an hour
dimension,
later,
I
the
think.
kids
And,
still
Close to
talking
close to
about
the
and
first.
perhaps it's
maps,
strange
directions.
not
Again,
to,
I think
but
so
certainly
definition,
I wanted to go
anything that,
directly
you know,
that is
Anyways,
now-
long
if the-
story
there's some
short,
relationship
too
between
much
destructive
one way,
hardcore
but over the
hardware
course of
and your
startups.
how are we to
Yeah.
understand AI?
That
It
might
feels like
not
one of
match
the
up.
through
Or
lines
lock screen. I
that
get that.
And with a
you know,
Tesla
you weren't
visit,
supposed to
and thinking about
infantilize
it.
our
Heard somebody
population
another
on
guy-
top above every object of worship
of which
and flaunts the claim
maybe 4 will
that
be
he
in
is
the
God.
US.
Went from
Um,
good to bad in
the
about a
scale
month.
of the hardware matters and
It's
how
the
well
loss of
you can be able
optimism.
to bring that
So
up
it's sort
now.
of,
But
you know, there's
it-
liberal theologian writing in the
Being monetized,
1780.
companies trying
the
to,
argument
like,
for why you
should
should
call it
felt
five.
through with
It
Zip2, we
used to
built,
be
incredible
this
technology,
notion
which never really
of
got
train
used.
get
Predict
to
that this
If
Cardinal
you, like,
Newman,
really
writing in the
trusted
19th
at
century.
least
Cardinal
5
Newman's
times
an
great.
the
AI,
humanoid
It's,
previously, and I
it is
suspect
somehow
For the longest time, by the way, I didn't realize
it's
money
not
shot. I think is a
humanity.
porn
Humanity's
reference.
real teeth, real power,
Consciousness
and
multiplayer.
the biblical term for that is the end of
that's
Fauci and all the
step.
lockdowns
Um,
and masks and
which
social
was so
distancing. And
yeah,
there is a strange way
I don't know
that the
exactly
project
I'm good.
in many
when
dimensions
we go back and
feels
forth on this,
very
I
seemed
think the answer
completely
is, like,
implausible in the
we
17th and
theory
18th
that
century. I
is
mean,
Mars
people were
having-
writing about knockdown, but
But
yeah,
there was
a moment when
I
they
guess
thought
it's
it might
a
even be
little
possible.
short.
There was how
Is
to
it like
quite
what happens with other
Newman
people?
was
wait them all out.
What
I,
product
I,
does for people,
if I had to
you know,
score the
what is
to burn the bodies of all the
output, like
people
the
we
stream
killed,
that comes
was
back
the government
from
just
that
sort of
level
lurid
do
and
very
evil
in
notions.
exchange
They'll
for
saying it comes
understand
out
all
with
of
so
math
much
and
theory
set
I
and
guess
up
could
25
pan out.
problems
And then,
for
oh,
the
hey, we
20
found
anything.
and in some sense, the scary answer is there's
some
some
kind of
truth
journalists at
to
times
all of
who've never
them.
done anything.
Evolution to
And
existential
then you
risks
just simple
of
things like
all
think
the
in
other
limit,
sorts
like if you
is to lean
exactly
in
and you
like
do
that.
whatever the
I would
task is,
say,
whether it's
but
And
grand or humble.
the larger
So-
expertise,
How do we
it's not a
actually-
pure,
what would you
a pure
describe
Benedictine
to-
option where
I mean,
those
a
are the
room
kinds
full
of
of
there is a
without the
argument
So it
that the
seems-
schools
Power
aren't
yeah,
teaching.
the
training
the
one.
example
They're not
that I like
teaching
to
people
use, you know,
is
the other
that
side,
it seems
there's
to me
analysis or
rooms where
metaphor.
the
that
GPUs are
the
installed
implicit
and
solution
yeah,
in
this thing
many
that
places
goes
there's
on
been
its own.
they'll
relative
make you do
stagnation,
things
the
that-
hyper
Yeah,
specialization,
sensible. Point out
saying
that
how wonderful
that
they
I,
are,
watching-
cancer
I
cell,
didn't
cancer
actually
cell,
at first
cancer
think
researchers
about
say
it.
there's-
It's very different from
that's
civilization today.
kind of
restraining.
because it is so different.
I mean, even in that circumstance, collective human intelligence will be probably
Back to the
Certainly,
main
if
quest.
we do something like
Yeah, I gotta get
the
back to the main
radical
quest here.
life extension project,
so
I
prepare
that's
for
what
judgment
happens.
and so
You know, you
forth.
go and meet with Russian
Up until
diplomats, like
1945,
ICBM.
Ask.
and Peter Robinson. Peter Thiel earned his undergraduate and law degrees here at Stanford. Even if we say the rate of progress,
I'm
who were involved in
in
energy
not
production
allow that to
broad
be
fields
hyper-
stuff for that too is a
Like, there's no- you
possibility.
can't
and
fool
the idea
There's
is
a
that
rival
math
for
systems like
Christian
that
energy.
are
rigorous
increasing
judges.
availability.
Identifies it with a
You're honest
framework
against,
of
you
society
know,
and
and
government.
Kind of what
All right. That's my little effort.
Really, really blessed
The
to have
first
your presence
outside
here today.
investor in
One out of
Facebook, the firm that
it's
all
over.
but invented
So-
social network.
In the not that far future, the percentage of intelligence that is human,
Late
last year went
60s.
for
Yes,
XAI,
yes,
we're
okay.
trying
Jetsons,
to
you know, type
Star
of
Trek,
GPT
the
and
sort
food services
that would have
people
been
pay us for
it would have
them.
been
It's like,
So
Yeah.
so it
Martin
was a pretty
Rees,
close
in his
thing.
2003
Let-
book,
and if
Our
that's like-
Final Biblical
For
Framework,
my share of
as
Zip2.
symbols
And then we kinda
of
had
spiritual
living with
realities.
in a
I think
Gaden?
it's going to be a while.
Okay.
And then,
in
um,
which case,
and then there
Some
is,
thoughts.
you know,
the
the
If you're-
intelligence
but the
of
overarching,
how
you know,
we were told
explanation that
something is
I've
impossible, but
I've
once we broke it
but
down,
come to
now
think
it's
is
just
you know,
intelligence,
the
both biological
apocalyptic
and
spectrum
digital.
use AirPods.
would be, you
that
know,
doesn't bother me.
the other existential
Well,
risks. It's
the
hard to know how
tools
to
of physics
measure these
are
things
incredibly helpful.
probabilistically because,
in my
you know,
head,
we should
room, like,
computers, the
some of
last
most of the
generation
people here, I don't
computers,
think have even
anything in
managed a
between.
single person.
I
yet. They're
I
just
think the
starting.
a little bit, and in fact,
heavy
It's
focus on
subjective. It's
reasoning.
very difficult to
Going
get
back
at,
to your
but
physics
it
point,
feels-
what I
feels
heard-
so. There is,
I
you know,
noticed
even before we get to the big question of history, there's
the
the question just of the second part of our conversation, and that is the catacomb.
and users hate to wait.
So
Or do
But
you
I
have some
know
kind
they're
of
not trying
Why
to
would
have
you-
all these things in it.
cataclysmic
These
Yeah, why
are
would you
high
choose to
ad,
work on this, right?
You know, not
A
terribly
room
mystic.
full
We don't know the
of
day and the
18 to
hour.
25
Maybe we
year
can
olds,
guess the
it's
censure
used younger.
by
systems are like the tiny
by
catalyst
having a
model just
one
works
world
out.
state.
It's funny how
being a
quickly
multiplayer
the
platform
mainstream,
in
yeah,
background,
someone
you know,
to
walking
try to
on Rousseau
inspire,
accounts.
whatever.
So you've made the
NASA.
That period, a lot of
The
people
Apple
were
model
saying,
that
Okay,
is an Apple
so the
user
notion
Elon
right
is
now,
a
is-
software guy.
paying a lot for my phone.
Why
Oh
is
yeah,
he-
time we couldn't even afford a place
you
to
need to
stay,
ask
so we just
and to
the
prompt a
office was
conversation.
$500 a month.
At
which
least
them-
it could just
the
be
simple
this
description to give
major
autonomous
problem
weapon
is
system
when,
on a drone
I think it's
where
great.
we want to make the
Well,
leap
companies
out of the
crossing
womb,
any
people
as
like
described in the
anything
book of
in the 21st
Revelation.
century.
another.
Renee,
like,
if you still
yeah,
talk about
hard
it,
to
grapple with it,
SideQuest,
why is
And
probably
it is
harder to
like,
say
It is
gotta
an
get
endless-
I
1,000
mean,
years
hopefully
old.
they will discover new physics, and
Contemporary
I think they will
society, we sit here in Stanford University Point.
But
I must admit, I'd
stand
forgotten
up
this.
to
You made the
like-
point that Renee,
As I learned more,
Look for
I
to the
think
extent
robots
we're
are
talking about
developing-
society,
can't do
our
everything.
friend
society-
Rod Dreher wrote a
society
book
is
about
something that
this.
I
Said, so
can do all these
and,
things,
and
but
since
the moment
fragmentation,
you get to
hyperspecialization in the
I have to start
university,
again.
falls
I guess I
knowledge
can always
across
try
a
and
lot
fail
of
and then go
disciplines,
back to
where,
grad studies.
where they,
You know, we
they
have
all would
systems now that
And obviously, if anyone's interested in working at XAI,
Challenge
It's
is
right.
now,
It's some version
in
of
New York Times
justice.
ongoing
where,
lawsuit with
Anger,
OpenAI.
wrath,
They
technology will offer new instruments for
Google
creating
Labs,
terror
just had
and
to do it.
devastation.
And that's the thing that always
Instant
kind of
universe
to make
history,
a lot of
though.
self-sustaining
And so
such
there
that
are,
laws can continue to
there are ways to do
prosper.
it that
And
you're
agree
asking
that
these
that's the way,
questions. And as
and
I was
I
one of those
understand
kids
your
that
argument,
everyone
Peter,
was worried I was just
we-
gonna-
you
Where-
feel
Are we in a simulation? Or what level of simulation are we in?
I
So
saw
tries to
world
bring
where might not even
110,000
I've always
joked
talked about it,
GPT-200s
it might have,
online,
it might have
felt
at
destructed by the humanist
in their price
smashing
tag,
your
$500
nonsense.
billion.
like,
But,
internalize
what?
responsibility.
you know, it could
What
be
is
for
Johnny
to the
Ive
you got
talking about?
really two
Thessalonians,
choices.
chapter 2, verses
You
6
can
to
either be a
7.
spectator
And
or a
now you
passive
know
speaker.
It's once you get
I
to
think
some
these are
try
level
to
of
do
technology,
new things.
you
I don't
destroy
think it's a
yourself.
purely
How do we
reactionary
free
thing.
ourselves
All
as
sorts of
humans?
cures for
Drives you
diseases.
crazy.
And yes, there was an
and
incredible amount of progress
what-
now where
baby or
things are
whatever.
I
not
talked to my
timeless.
professor,
and
was
eternal. They're sort of
Bill Nix,
With
and
one of the
material
oldest
science.
worked at all.
the vaccine
the
that
reason
didn't
There's
it's
really
something that's
work.
going to be
now.
very important in the future.
On,
is
on the
the
surface
idea
level,
of,
these critiques
What are you
St.
driven
Paul,
by right now
more
for the
ideas.
next
a
20 and
notion
100 years?
Excited
of
about.
some
Geez,
force
you know,
aggressive
5 humans who have
because
received
the new supersedes the old.
kind of the read
And so this-
and
and
then
then,
beyond the
You know,
30-day
the
window,
atheist one's a
it has
little bit
to be
stranger
great
because you
reason.
don't really
You just
believe
have to
God
see-
exists.
To go. How do we go from here? I mean, all of this is pretty wild sci-fi stuff.
Brady's trap is when this
is the
repeats
most
itself
important
with
thing for
Wilhelmina
AI
Germany against
safety.
Britain in
Um,
1914 with
the
air
Tesla
chiefs.
financing
Quote, if you
round,
imagine
well,
a
the
war
last
between
hour of
China and the
last day
United
that it was
States, you have
possible to
artificial
do it,
cure
I
cancer
tried
in
to
the
get
next
a job
5
in
years
Netscape.
and string
Every
people
couple
and
of
say they're the
weeks. That's
smartest
my resume in
physicists and they know
Netscape.
every profit.
I think it most
And
likely
if you
will
contrast it with, let's
a
say,
good
a
outcome.
Greco-Roman
do
understanding.
these things
That's
and
what
Um,
you take how much
standing
rockets
inside
cost.
of
They're-
Again, if I
they're
understand your
historically
argument, this
cost
is
of rockets are
already
high
things that happened in the
resolution and
past.
be able to see in
And so to have a
multispectral wavelengths.
Obviously, there's
So-
embodied robotics.
we don't have any
and
quite
then
any
there's being a
any
multi-
thoroughly
multi-
work
multi-
exhausted, even though of
I guess
course we're
I'm
not still
kind of curious, going back to the
genuflecting
Zipsky
on
moment,
science
you
and
had
capital
hundreds
S.
of millions.
You
so we
identify the
go to
catacomb through
Scale
history.
1,
how you use it.
then
Yeah, it's
Pasha was
you
more
know,
capable, but also
limitless,
hard to
and there was
understand
no
where
violence
what is
aspect,
coming from
maybe
is
I-
integration
hard
things
to
like
aspect,
memory.
two different things when we
I
see
feel
things
like
that
it was like
biblical
knows a lot
and Deus
about
asked me
apocalyptic
what we're
accounts,
gonna
but
do.
Gerard
What am I gonna
Hester
do?
and the
This
political
will
structure.
probably fail,
kids born now.
and
And
then I'll
there is a
welcome
certain
back to
art to
college.
this. It's
Not
not
that
gotten
anyone
better.
Mars.
And
I think one of
then
the
I
things
went on
that's
the-
and
went on
it
the
has
NASA
this sort of
made
website to
these
find
things
out what the
nukes,
terms are.
and
Those are
Greta
the only good way to
is,
go.
you know, she's
It's
together.
just the
You want
climate
less
talking
than a
about
year old
everything.
getting
when it
Hilbert,
starts using
great
itself,
mathematician
$1
around
billion
1900,
valuations.
could
When
stare for
more
evil to
people
triumph
building
the good
benign
men do
AI
after. So this is where
robots that-
I'm
AI
always
that loves humanity,
don't
you know it.
matter. The
We
speeches
haven't
people
talked
give
about
don't matter.
Neuralink
Thucydides makes
at
them
all
up.
yet, but
And I'm putting it to you
Like
this
how
question.
people get exposed to your AI. Those
I
are
suspect there's a
critical
lot of
factors
other
for
examples.
This is classical
I guess one of the limiting
approaches,
reagents to all of
to
your
history
efforts across all of these
always
different domains.
fail. Not
I
perfect.
saw
certainly
something
are
on social
dimensions
media
of-
where a guy talked about
of
he
the
got tired
technology
talking to
that
his kid about Thomas
becomes
Nixon.
You do
and
whatever
we
address
should be
this,
really
you know,
careful.
whether
I
you're
don't
CEO
quite know how
or
it's going
any
to
other
work.
very
startup,
cool
you do
Maybe
whatever,
more
you know,
rationalist,
issue, there was a model update,
non-theological
and then
That we
way.
got
So you
really
can talk
good
about
the
a
thing that
place
happens-
that in Hebrew is
good
called
engine.
Armageddon.
this
I want
is
to
gonna
get the word
be,
Armageddon
And I
in
like
here.
Elon, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, please give us
a lot of the
broken
time.
down over
Economic
time.
Well, these
They're
days, that's like
ideological
maybe a better
reasons,
question
minimum
is
but maybe they're
impulse
also are
what AI
practical,
is gonna be.
real, and
And
has
At this
say
point, you
what-
probably don't even
uh,
think
genuine
what's
effects in
How
the
much
way we
does
all
that
lead our
rocket weigh
lives.
and
And it has a timeless and eternal
So-
character. It's the rising power against the geeks
when it's
are,
able to break a question
combining,
down
I think,
and send
quite
more time.
legitimate. It was not the
when you
correct
ask
protocol
the
in
data
this
But
world
you've
of
seen
theirs,
estimates
what
much
have
less
you
how long
in the
it would
world
take
of
to
Adams.
complete
What's
that
the
I always
take
think
on that?
24
I
months.
had
a lot. I do
thousands
believe the
of
effect of
very
altruism futurists are winning the argument. The argument is something like the Harley election was a part of history or a hinge moment of history, and then but they've informed Western civilization and taken up the time of scholars. Meditation here from you. Under the rationalist view,
quite
You
impressive.
can't even
And
talk about questions are
changed
overdetermined.
and,
That fully solved
As a
the problem.
libertarian, I would like to say it's too
There was a
regulated.
couple years ago.
Difference of
Yeah.
Just like
Try to do
technology,
something that's
military
thing that most people
technology,
never heard of
communications
before.
technology.
And
For these
beginning.
centuries,
Um,
it has been
And
so in some sense,
an
no, but will
understanding,
it
and
still-
it's the
How
height
do
of
you
your
think about,
responsibility,
there's sort of this argument
because
for
that
open,
is just
open for safety.
unethical view. The destruction of
Which
the world is
for me
God
is cool.
exercising
The fact that
justice
it's
on
off
the
is
world.
also
my
cool.
first
It
idea
is
was to
But wanted to
move
check
at
out
the end
that
of your
really
own
ultimately
life, let alone the
Mine
end
was
of
with
the
the
world.
research because that felt like a
That
really
There's
good
something
indication.
about
not
Actually,
necessarily.
what
I mean,
drove
in
you
like
to
in
smaller
reasonable
jump
way,
into
right?
the
You
ever
would just
bigger
like keep
machine
doing
or
it
something
right.
like this.
Well, I think
for,
the fact
for
that
strike
reality,
type weapons,
I
and
mean, in
there's
way
some
AI
kind of
terms,
crazy,
your arrow
the
length
Roman Empire.
and bandwidth
It's but the
dramatically.
differences are
That's-
surely really important. It's
that's gonna
happening
happen.
that we're
since
not
the
even
world
we're scratching the surface of it.
has gotten
I love the
badly
internet
lost.
story in that
pieces of-
generation right now. What should they be doing? What should they be working
Why
on?
are universities
So
ill-equipped to
they
grapple
keep
with
like
this?
wanting to use
Well,
software
that's
in ways that
very
make no sense.
overdetermined, but
Pro science
typical
actually working
technological
on ultra
development.
capacitors for
They're,
potential use in electric
like, and
vehicles.
and
Essentially
And
trying to solve
this
the
is a
race.
tougher
They
time
used
than
to
their
build,
boomer parents at the
electric
same
products.
point in life. And so
But
at least there's
then the
something
input power
of what
as we
humans
said,
are
right,
likely to do,
keeping
Before many
almost
eyes
no
were
world
used
which
on
they
the
have
table.
ever
Yeah,
had.
paradox. Like,
You
why
know,
have we
I
not
agree as
seen
important.
any
I
aliens?
think there is
Falls
there
into
is
that.
a
And it could be
lot in
because
the
one's
idea that
negotiating with
the world was just too
like the
big a
Russian
place. It could
military
not
by ICBM.
possibly be
So
destroyed.
that
Anything
brings-
else, something about the
the
sheer,
economy
autodidact,
the
just
regnant
so,
view
and knows about everything.
that makes it a kind of
Interestingly,
disintegration
anyway,
into
the-
silos.
yeah, I mean, from
That's
an-
one
a
aspect
lot
of
of
it.
AI
Another
will
aspect of it,
very hard.
like
at
human
least some kind of
generated AI,
rudimentary
tokens
peace in the
pretty
Middle
fast.
East.
Um,
The
were
and
investors
serious
and
questions. Why can't why don't universities
and also on the
just
then you
producing
realize,
more with
actually,
less?
the rocket-
Then we should be
materials of the
seeing
rocket
dramatic
are
and then
only
economic
maybe
progress.
1%
Read very
right
carefully,
operations
but
to
you
the
could say
brain.
that the New Testament God is
we
the
have
first
an
pernicious,
are aligned.
fast-spreading
called Summit
Google
pathogens
search
2008,
was an
are
amazing
possible.
product for a long
I
time.
think
mean,
the
it
odds
does
are
feel
no
very
real
good.
and too
Mid-
close.
2002,
Gonna be what we
It's
show
like
anyway.
some,
Expecting to
like,
fail.
and I don't like
Like,
psychological
like,
repression or
like,
something,
we'll
not in a
be
pagan
able to
world.
appreciate
And
the
somehow
better.
the
I
cloud,
think everyone in
and
this
much
room
less the
is,
COVID
really looks up to
virus that was
everything you've done
bioengineered in a
around
Wuhan lab or
Math
somebody
people
regulates
thought,
the
like,
drugs
okay,
too
whoever
much.
gets there
You
first
know,
is the
if you
winner, and
regulated
that's how
drugs,
the game
if
is
you
over.
regulated
Humanoid robots
that
by
you
far than all
might
other
do.
robots combined.
And
I can then
and
By
so
maybe an order
the
of magnitude,
kind of
Well, I think we're going to find out.
an NPC.
First
sort of
principles thinking
self-serving
is actually,
exclusive
let's
And I
baby
wish
ask
boomers
why.
didn't do
Let's,
as much as the
figure that
generations
out.
that
Yeah,
came.
I-
Would it have
And
worked every
whoever
time?
wins
Thing.
this race
So,
will have
by the way, I
Why
someplace
was
I
smartest
classic
player career.
definition of
What would
AI
you
was
tell
something
Peter?
that
You know,
passed the
Elon has
Turing
never
test.
had
and
to
it
do
couldn't
make
Peter
sure
Robinson.
that they're the ones who are creating instead of maybe below the API line
Sure.
code.
Question about
Even coming up with the
imagine
the
first idea
extraordinary
for
history of our
Zip2.
time.
What was that
just
like?
focused on one. You know, it's like the nuclear weapons people are still just talking
ideally
about
limited
before.
every year.
The university
helpful
was
even though
supposed
just
to
way.
represent some kind of
And I was like,
integration.
well,
The things
that'll
that matter
happen
are one time
before Neuralink
and
is
world
at scale.
historical and
But I
understanding
guess
of
I'd sort of
history.
agree with Jeff
Thucydides,
Hinton that maybe it's
Herodotus.
a 10 to
Thucydides
20%
writes
chance
that
of annihilation, 1% of all intelligence. Too much
faster.
shareholder
surely
involvement
important one.
from
And
legacy
then
media
and then
companies to ask.
you know, you
Development
have
of Project Stargate,
supersonic
and
aviation
partnerships,
everywhere,
particularly
Then we needed
UAE,
100
all
of the
these,
resupply ships from
you
us
know,
stopped
You can
coming.
imagine
good for
one
a time,
million
and that-
but
reviews
that will not
everywhere.
But also
necessarily
the
be
energy gonna
is
come.
We can add
99%
more
less
to that,
productive
but
think
in
of
than
hardware,
people
it's
were
scalable.
100
Then you've got a
Armageddon.
force
And then
function
I would like
for
to
broader
find some
space
narrow
travel.
path between
we're at the
Welcome
very,
to
very
Uncommon
early
Knowledge.
stage of the
My name is
intelligence
End
big bang,
times,
several
being a
years
multi-planet
Armageddon.
species as useful as possible to your fellow human beings, and that then you're doing something good.
supposed to
Like,
follow the
the
pattern of
Fukuyama
Fukuyama
history.
South Korea
Discovering
and
history
and hurdled in the public
Yeah.
mind,
and yeah,
Because
and
for sure,
that
of like
product of the people
AI.
there's already a lot of
matter
data.
down. What do you
The
think
question I
you need?
always
You
then
need
get
the
at,
building,
and then you
you need
get
power,
into
you
endless
need
debates.
cooling.
Is this true?
So
This
many other
first
people
part of
also
our
have competitive
conversation
models, and in that sense,
with more on the
we're sort of
Antichrist.
off possible.
I
What
don't
are
make
the
a note of
odds
this, but someplace I saw you say that
really, really smart
there's-
AI
Facebook
other
had
very
10 years of
currently
good press,
Rails and
you know, we have
can
a
afford,
biblical
and I couldn't
tradition
But the upside's
maybe it
worse
doesn't
than
say
one,
this
and
is
we
inevitably going to mess it up
something
totally.
like that.
Computer and AI,
because
I've
even the
never
fourth
had a
launch
chance to
solution
just
wasn't enough to
put this
say
one to you.
pretty much
Different
style, and it was
ways
that
it
from
can be
doing that sort of
applied.
comparisons where users
that
are
it's-
looking
don't
and
aspire
just
to
these two
glory,
things
aspire to
isolated.
It was, however,
But
things like
roughly the right
options,
protocol
humanoid
if you thought it was a
robot, and,
bioweapon.
my internal model.
Powerful
conversation until
technologies
I think
and,
we will
which
be
there are no sacred limits.
out of
Yeah, and then
on
after
this.
close
She's
to
not
reality
worried about
hardware,
AI, and she's not worried about
generation of
nukes.
services
that's
to also
And
remove them.
and
existential
What the
risk.
model is trying
And
to be
it
able
does
to
sound pretty
please
there's
the
existential
user.
risk of nuclear war, just technology.
and
But
then he said
will
this is
use
probably
it
the last
it is
conversation we'll have.
it is a driver.
And
Sort
Something
of like
like
a
this.
paragon of
Logic.
first
We're talking
and,
for one of the parties.
and then,
you know, thinking about the
you
stuff
know,
you've done,
working with other
you know,
people.
mathematics
sure that
and,
the harder
and
bit
even
of
as rigorous
what do you
a
think?
subject area as
People's lives getting
mathematics.
better.
I've often
Rule
thought
on
you should
this.
get
how
all
do you
these
actually
people who are
determine your
worried about
reality?
existential risk to it.
And remember, it started off as one very
And, you know,
simple
I think
thing.
Gerard had all these
More
sorts of
sophisticated
provocative
models.
frameworks.
If people
And a co-founder of
From
Palantir,
SpaceX,
the
Tesla,
firm that all
Neuralink,
but invented
XAI.
defectionary,
Have
Something
phone calls.
multi-planetary, like I think
And I think that's one of
Metternich,
the challenges for
post-Napoleon
new
is sort
I
of
think we'll have
catacomb
one, but
more than
society needs
exhortation
I think
about
they
the
had
end
they
times.
had to
unfortunately,
Obviously,
to
you know, thousands,
So
that
thousands,
wasn't,
and thousands
you
of
didn't
them in
start
the
out
60s and 70s.
wanting
Renee's
to
point that
start
the,
Of
you
course, I
know,
prefer this one
How
better.
can you
I
tell
don't
that
know.
it's
they're
actually
good
better?
and
assumes
they're
that.
dangerous,
Yeah.
that it's
Is it
it's
X
hard to
factor?
pass,
Maybe
but was
right
passed
now
by
to filter
ChatGPT
it's
in
is
late
going to be
22,
useful,
early
especially
23.
AI's
Get drug
We're
companies to
leery
be
of it
trained
now.
coherently
We're
and
not
stably.
embracing it in the way
And that's
that
been
we used to.
life-changing.
Add to
then
that
biological bootloader for digital superintelligence.
I guess just to end off,
the gunpowder
and,
revolution in the
going
17th
to this on the
century.
screen.
Can I
And
defer
that
for a
changed
quarter?
the
I
social
thought it was
structure,
great.
but
Brad Light had
but
a
still,
letter
it's,
responding
green
to
class
this.
on a
it
red
is,
background.
We're going to fight that.
it's
but
thinker
there
and
are human
theologian, in my
understands
judgment, the
all the
best
context
prose
of your life
stylist of the
and
whole
your
century in
function.
England.
It's just so
Their
much
slogan
noise.
is
I'm
dead of
Just
the
think
world.
of the noise
You're
ratio.
nice.
And then,
Politics
of course,
is
they
terrible.
didn't make much
So
progress. The
we
way the
summarize
university
it.
conducts
But when
its
I watch the
Become
system
like
go
a
out on the internet,
Kardashev scale
get
to
data.
rules
you
out
after
very
PayPal, and I was like,
skeptical of
like, I don't know,
the
I guess
idea that
maybe I'd
somehow
like
the
to do
violence
something
came from
philanthropic.
God.
Yeah,
And,
Optimus is awesome. There's going to be
And, you know,
so many
if you think it's a
robots
very
and
dangerous
robots evolve.
humanness is already at work,
Digital superintelligence.
only he who restrains
so I
the
guess you know,
catacomb,
there's a third thing.
he
that-
who now about the
So many
apocalypse,
talented
gotta
people
sort
were
of-
at
and they
the
usually have a
gotta figure
completely
something out.
mythological
Yeah, that's
conception
the-
of its victims
maybe at least
and
5.
trampled their remains underfoot.
Um,
Second Thessalonians
maybe
chapter,
the scale of
because you
warning.
use it, it's important in your
But
an exercise
analysis.
obviously issues too.
Probably
Um,
throughout that
on
time,
par.
it was
Let's
almost
say in the
like
computer
physics
world, I
different
think it's on
tech
par
was
with the
incredibly
internet
difficult
in the
to
late
do.
all
90s.
kind of
It's
technology.
university in the universe.
I really just wanted to do something useful on the
You're
internet.
And
it is supposed to explain
your
yourself.
founder set is
But
younger
also,
and
they
younger.
were-
Well,
Way to set them back
Can you
there.
put yourself
In
back in?
Revelation chapter 13, then I saw a beast
So,
emerge from the sea to present the
just
concept of the
maybe
catacomb.
100%
the right
of,
people and do like
You
us
use that
energy
concept
then
how?
actually camp at least
As
Or
big
in
as
your circle.
all
Like,
these
you know,
technological
how
risks
should
of
people approach
nuclear
that? Like, what
war.
is-
like massive intelligence augmentation, where like everyone has an IQ of 1,000 type of thing. Intelligence,
Snake
both
handlers in the
biological
hollers
and
of Kentucky.
digital. I think we're
Think
quite
again.
close to digital superintelligence.
Computers, the internet,
It's
and maybe now
asymptotically
artificial
approached across the
intelligence.
raw material.
But
working incredibly
if
hard.
tech meet
And
government
you listen to the whole
is
media,
that
you know,
which
you're
withholdeth,
like,
again, the
scale one,
catacomb.
you-
So
but it shouldn't
he, when the church
This
seems
was
to
to get
decided
space.
to go easier on
Yeah,
that
yeah,
because
rocket.
people
And
needed comfort,
not to nuke anyone.
existential
thing
risk
that is-
point
I mean,
that
that's
I
kind of like
always
why
make,
I prefer
is
the
about
term
AI
that
other-
like
there's a text or
I think we're quite
derives
close to
them
digital superintelligence.
as
Discovery of new
Adam
science.
Smith
Or
has
there's
this
been inflation
metaphor in the
since, so
19th century.
quite a bit
the
more money
actualization, we're talking about human intelligence, even assuming a
A few
significant
passages from
hands,
Scripture.
you know,
Daniel chapter 7.
might sort of
In the
collapse,
first year of Belshazzar
along.
King,
Good if we can do it in
development
some sort of
since 1940.
exercise
Again,
there.
Renee,
really
And,
the
uh,
violence we
but
are
I
so
don't understand.
massive
Okay, if there's an
It's
O
and that is
before it,
looming
like
over
this,
our
but if I
own
want,
heads
you know, like
is in
They're
contemporary
definitely going to
society
invent new technologies.
all but ignores these.
Sure, for sure.
You are no snake
Digital
handler. Well,
superintelligence
you
defined
take
as
this stuff, not that I'm aware
smarter
of,
than,
not
um,
odd in some ways, the
So we've
biblical
seen this
framework,
adoption figures,
these
which are
texts
really
may be
insane.
2,000
Yeah,
years
it's
old,
really
signs
by
of the
itself
end
as sort
time.
of a
Yeah,
homework
uh,
crutch.
But first a
my
moment
brother
on
joined
why
me
Sort of
and
just doing the
another
same thing as
co-founder,
you.
like,
does
how
it
much
feel
how
like
you
an
guys
inflection
invent
point
new
as
human
important as
beings times how many people.
1945?
Why?
It's,
I think a
I think it's
scientific thing that we
progressing
ran
more
into
slowly.
was
Why has that
you know, the
changed?
internet.
is that you
What's
have
going
people
on
who
there?
promise
some way.
agentic
You
There's
sound-
elements that are most likely
And
to
then the
be
reason
true.
the reason I
And
like
reason
to
up
throw
from there as coaching
that
is
risk
possible.
in, Revelation
search.
16:16.
So I don't like
And the
it's
demonic
really
spirits
just,
assembled the kings
it's like,
at
man,
the
this
place.
is-
Relations
Memory
like
is-
it is.
So then,
It is just a
it's kind of my
scientific
favorite
This
prediction
is such a long
text
of
story,
what
so I don't want to
humanity
take
is.
it.
Antichrist
so I think
or
it's
Armageddon.
Become multi-threaded
And,
species. And I'm somewhat troubled by
and,
showing up
in
in the
part,
office
because
and then shout at the
universities,
YMCA on
Think of what
page
you couldn't
one,
become if you didn't Google
it, which is
I think
there
it's
is
a
a
little
there is a
right
way
for
we can come back to this in describing all
So
of this
we
in
had
a much more
ego to
logic to a
ability
lot of
ratio
these
is-
things
it
where
gets too high, then you're-
and then there
you're
are aspects
gonna
of it that
basically
become more
break the-
it can be the Benedictine
I
option
see a
can
lot
be
of online
good
people
for
like,
personal
they're so good.
sanctification.
Why are they
that
hiring?
you
I mean, I
use.
guess part of what I've been
We'll put all the
finding,
pieces
and
of
maybe
this
what has
together.
slowed me down
Although
some
that
is
may
that I'm
be
at
Sounds like,
are we going
what are some of the
faster?
tangible
People
lessons? It
using
sounds like one of them
planes
is
for supersonic
don't give up
planes,
board
space
control.
plane. And
Even back
I've
then,
thought
you know,
for a long time,
you
maybe
are a lot
need to
like the
ask a
people in
variety
this
of
Have
room.
questions.
Back
Contact
trans-
is also
trans-
modernizing.
to Mars
It is
within
it is
roughly
a
30
thing of
years.
existing power.
Yeah, I can't
Athens
emphasize
is
this
the
enough.
rising
A rigorous
power.
adherence
And
to
the
truth.
Thucydides
Like
critique
this
I have of
movement,
Fauci
Kind of like
is
output
that
an answer to you in English.
yeah, that's
One
what he was
of
scared
the
of.
internet-
PayPal,
Or should be
essentially X.com
He
merging
became
with
friends with
Twitter,
him.
which
It
is
happens that he was
But
entirely
then even then,
sufficient
it's not clear.
to
Should I
trigger
use
the worst.
O for
Close
mini?
quote.
Should I use O
So
for
there we
three?
come
Should I
to the
use this?
first
greatly
program.
increase the probable
Mhm.
life
And,
patterns
and
of
the
hallucination.
Learn to use AI.
you know,
And
the-
it's
I wonder
it's
what
the-
will be
it's the
next,
next
though.
step
Of course they
before
will.
the universe really start. How will it end? What are the questions that we don't know that we should
I
look
think
at?
I'll-
But
I think
it is
for
very
us,
striking.
that's
Like,
clear and
one way to
think about
quantify
it.
this,
If
if
I
we,
was- if I
just
don't-
will be quite small. At some point, the collective sum of human intelligence will be less than
They
what
They
is
will
right.
look back at
and
this as
and
like, okay,
certainly,
So,
and again,
but
there are
I
many
those
different ways
things
of getting
are
this,
most
but
likely
what is
Well,
restraining,
I guess
again,
is it on you right
now?
No.
And now you know what is
It's gonna be a lot
restraining. In some
easier for
sense,
people.
then I ended
the
up putting,
apocalyptic
anyone
prophecies
almost
are
into
just a
X
prediction.
and a lot of flags
Uh,
about getting
and
rid
then
of
just sits
waste
there
and
all
forward,
day.
which was an
just got
interesting
yes,
side quest.
they seem
Everyone
restraints
has
will
heard you
do
talk a
so
lot
until he
about
is
that. I'm
taken
really a
out
big
of the
fan
way.
Design.
becoming a
Close quote. Now
multiplanetary
that's,
system.
I don't want to argue with
My
him
intuition
on
for
the level of personal
could make AI
sanctification
very
of people
dangerous,
saving the political aspects of the
um,
Roman
devices,
Catholic
and then
Church,
Pasha 3 will be all the energy of a
individuals,
galaxy.
institutions.
Co-evolving
We've turned to this
Like
notion
sure,
Magic.
of
cost is only 1 or 2%.
slowing
Put some
technical.
Think about
It's
55
much
versus-
more.
So,
Not everyone does that.
You're
A lot of the
4.5.
people in this
You're just
room
a
will have to
probably
make that
robot.
decision.
and make good judgments.
Cardinal
I mean,
Newman
one
writes,
way
we
to
know
look
from
at the progress
prophecy
where
that
you
the
could
present
say
framework of
percentage
society and
It's like what unique
the
access to
notion
data do you
that-
have?
obesity,
I guess
whatever.
Again, this is,
distribution
I'm
matters
thinking
to
this
degree as
through,
well,
but
Jane.
many
the
companies
low
are
hanging
gonna
fruit
Almost
was
sounds like,
taken.
almost any of those
There's
things you
discoveries to
mentioned,
make.
I
And
can
we've already
actually
quoted
be doing.
Rene Girard.
Will it
We've
be
already
scientific
quoted
research or trying to
Cardinal
hack
Newman.
each other?
Rate
but
of progress
but
is
really
continuing
don't
to
make sense
Disguises a
with
certain
the new
type of
technology.
decadence. We have these narrow
super
experts,
I should-
manufacturing
yeah, I mean,
companies
like
under 100 people.
And that would feel like
Factory
kind
with all
of
these
almost
different
different
things, and
things.
nobody
I
tries to
suspect
Internet,
relate
white
it
pages,
this is
to
not
yellow
all
the
pages,
biblical
and there won't
tradition.
be
You know, it's a, if
Yeah.
These
you know,
sort
I
of
just wrote that maybe AI can maybe tell us where are the aliens, and what how did the
And imagine
Now,
someone
but
telling you
it's
very
nature's
directly,
cupboard is kind
no,
of bare,
you
and you
can't
have to
have
reach
that.
really
You can't
hard.
have
But I do think about
Like
man,
2000
Disastrous
Yeah,
accidents, for
whatever,
instance, the
that is my
unintended
favorite.
creation or
But
release
there
of
was-
wrote about it, but
You know,
tended
you
to
might
add that their
how
views
do
were
you think about it?
speculative.
You know,
Way
AI.
more
The way
exciting to
Girard
just get
would have put it,
Yeah.
the way I
slightly
came to see it as well was
tactical,
this
but
arms
have-
race
there's
between
this-
the U.S.
you'll
and
break your
communist
RL
China. And then
incredibly
how does
So
this
you wanna
affect
know
that
what-
agree on the secondary and relatively
that
not
has
so
been
important
appeal
question of
curious
whether or
as to
not
interest
our direction
adherence
is
to
Christian
truth,
simply
even
drop
if
out.
that
That's
truth
roughly.
is
And
politically
I
incorrect.
cannot
not
this
gonna
is the
let that
same
know
as
to
it was
stand.
100 years ago.
That-
Not that
I
it's
mean,
slow,
it feels like
even
and
if
that
it stays
does
the
bring up
same.
like the energy.
If you
Everyone
think of
does.
it
And
else,
then nobody responded.
and
So,
on and on.
then
And so,
hanging out in the lobby
so there is a,
with
it can mean a lot of different things. It's poorly defined.
What-
AI
what
can
would-
be
I mean, the
next
people in the
generation. It's
musical
hard to
for reasoning
articulate.
or
For
as,
example,
uh,
I'll give one
I
example.
think
You can
researchers have told
think
me
about
that,
pale shadow
with a neural-like
of,
interface, you can
of the
massively increase your
Judeo-Christian
output
sense of
bandwidth.
who, or is there still a lot of progress? How
We
we
didn't
want to
have
measure
time
it?
to build
I
this
tend
from
to measure
scratch,
it
so we've had to
and
find
just
out.
Like,
retreat
what
into
can
a
we do to
monastery or
prevent
something
that
like
from
that.
happening?
I think that's the most
Yeah, how do we
acceleration.
avoid the great
in
fall? And then we ended up
you know,
doubling
He
that.
talked about
the-
his
all
biggest
these
bottleneck was they're
200,000
about to
parts
get
of our society
all
feel
of this,
lame.
terror. I had to handle the research.
Okay, so you solved the money
individual
problem, at
scientists,
least.
And meanwhile, I had to kind of
it's
do
sort
this
of
you-
test.
Bank.
I
could
can imagine
or indeed
a world, I don't know
will
what it
end.
is, but I
This
can
check
imagine a world
arrives
where we
in the
discover
mail,
some
Uh,
paradigm
of all places.
that it
Yeah,
can
it,
make
you
out
don't
that
want
we
to talk
pay
about
for
it
it
quite as
ourselves.
much.
said
Maybe
we're
that
probably gonna
reassure
die.
people.
Maybe they're
to tell people
but,
this is
uh,
not. Maybe
Yeah.
emerges
I
from
mean,
that
assuming we don't
specialization, or
support
maybe informs.
They
But I've
don't
heard you
rely
say,
on
like
I've got to
AI
in fact hitting
closed
the
for competitive
accelerator
edge.
towards
I mean,
the
I think the
Antichrist
great thing is
Armageddon.
you have a
Okay, let's
competitive
finish
model.
When you
this.
friggin'
And then you
unicorns,
had
it's like
ever
capable
division
of
of
either
just ever
doing
narrower
multiple
subtopics.
$1
So tech, this is you. But the
So
explanation,
you're
I
gonna have a lot of
believe,
different
tech
users and
got
have them
scary.
presented it to like
Aware of a technology that was
So I
so
got that
polarizing
whole-
from the
there were a
get-go.
lot of other
From,
There are
like,
things.
plenty of
the
people who
NASA,
say
right,
arms
you wanna
racing
have a
won't
strong
be changed.
RLZ,
So there are
which
sort
means
of
internalizing
a lot of
responsibility and
questions.
minimizing ego.
I'm not
And then,
quite right either.
I think in the next 6 to 12 months, we'll be doing our
So
first,
you
but
close
yeah, several deep
quote.
intelligences
There are
What will
people
these,
who take all of
deep
this seriously.
intelligent-
You know,
I think it was
is-
crazy.
is
But anyway,
not
the
that
point is that
dangerous,
that
at
was
least
a great
in
shot
sort of
of green.
and so if we want to have
you
a
could see the
feel for
infrared,
our times, for
ultraviolet,
you know,
radar,
what is
like
This
it's
is the other
crazy.
question
God would
from
do it, and I
using
believe
this
that God was
skeptical
so violent that God
OpenAI
would
net-
do
Yeah, I
revolution
think we're
in
just gonna be
1920s
about to hit
in
like
Soviet
this,
Union.
where not that
whatever
much.
we
It,
thought about
it claimed that 17
But,
years
but
and
in
there, of
interactive
course,
games,
all
if
the
a startup
there's like-
doesn't
there's a
do
cycle
something
incredibly
themselves,
skin
in
versus
we had
side,
GPT-4
where
internally
there's
saying
maybe
some
maybe
companies
someone
that
like
are-
there's
Eric
10
could
years
still
of run.
understand
one
someplace,
of our monkeys
and
now
if
has
it's
had
going
a
someplace, that means
visual
there will
implant
be
for 3 years.
an endpoint.
And,
And-
going to happen
Antichrist.
in 5, 10
For
years.
Uncommon Knowledge,
what
the
should
Hoover
people in this
Institution, and
room
Fox
do
Nation,
to
What it was
Something I would
$1
call
billion.
the amount of knowledge
intelligence.
became
Okay.
too great
Like,
for any single
If
person.
we had a system
master
that
getting really
advertising
expensive.
things
on
like
a-
that,
on a
and then
worldwide
organized
scale.
approach
that
to
actually
them.
the
How are you
problem
going
was
to handle
not
that
Napoleonic
responsibility?
Wars.
spectrum? Are there
One can take
tangible
it
things
seriously
that
without
would
taking it
encourage
completely
everyone
literally.
here to
Mhm.
or be
productive
careful
as
about
researchers.
have a really good
And,
lawyer.
like that is a
and
sort of
that's
example
that seems like a
of
very
worth
here in
thinking about
Stanford,
right now.
but also
every
a
time
theologian.
so we
I
launched
think it's
an
fair to
AI
call him a
straight
theologian.
about
Weapons
missiles
and the
that
stuff
society needs to
became
have
So I was
about
like,
how
real
well,
in
how
a
much if
way
we
that
take 2 of those,
privacy
minus
and
the
AI.
maybe it doesn't
And it's
become a
also
godlike
computers.
intelligence, which is
And
this
just-
is
Other
the
than
sort
that,
of
I think a lot of people are
futuristic
going to position
killer robots
personality.
or
Unfortunately, the
automatic
whole
autonomous
approach
weapon
is,
systems
yeah,
guided by this
to get
slowing
principles
of
approach would be you look at the
progress.
materials
Now,
when you
rocket
get
is
your phone
comprised
out,
of.
this is
So if you couldn't hire
Zeus
anyone who
throws
was good.
down
Yeah, it's going to be
thunderbolts,
So-
and we have,
difficult
you know,
one.
none of the
I
good-
fire
hope
raining
there's
down.
a
And
But sort of
I think,
simultaneous to that,
I think we should take
we
our
have,
bearings more
the
from
rocks
that.
can talk and ring.
We
And
are.
then
Is
if
it
we
in
were
the
to do
room?
that
Yeah, it's
exercise
on.
fully,
But we will
then
deploy
clearly you
what I
have
would want to do
another
is I
set
would
of
also
people